The air on the night of August 24th, 1814, did not smell of victory or triumph in the traditional sense. It smelled of roasted meats, expensive wines, and the acrid, biting scent of burning cedar. In the heart of the American capital, the humid summer darkness was pushed back by an unnatural orange glow that flickered against the low clouds of the Maryland sky. Down Pennsylvania Avenue, the sound of disciplined bootsteps had replaced the chaotic shouting of retreating militia. These were not the ragtag rebels of a generation prior, nor were they the disorganized raw recruits of the American frontier. These were men of the 4th, 44th, and 85th Regiments of Foot, battle-hardened veterans of the Napoleonic Wars, soldiers who had marched across the Iberian Peninsula and stood toe-to-toe with the French Imperial Guard. Now, they stood in the center of Washington, D.C., the muddy boots of the British Empire resting firmly on the manicured carpets of the American struggle. Inside the Executive Mansion, later known to history as the White House, a surreal scene unfolded. The dining hall was set for 40 guests. Crystal goblets sparkled in the candlelight. Silver platters held cooler upon cooler of wine. It was a victory feast prepared for President James Madison and his generals, intended to celebrate the defeat of the British invaders. But the president was gone, having fled into the Virginia woods hours earlier, leaving the meal steaming on the table. In his place sat Major General Robert Ross, the gentleman commander of the British Expeditionary Force, and Rear Admiral George Cockburn, the Royal Navy's ruthless enforcer in the Chesapeake. They did not flip tables or smash windows in a fit of rage. Instead, with the calm detachment of officers who had seen empires rise and fall in Europe, they sat down and ate the president's dinner. They toasted the health of the Prince Regent with the president's own wine, the clinking of glass the only sound in the abandoned mansion. Once the meal was concluded, the business of war resumed. The order was given not with a shout, but with a quiet nod. Soldiers piled furniture in the center of the grand rooms, mahogany chairs, velvet drapes, and tables of exquisite craftsmanship. Torches were applied. The fire caught quickly, fed by the varnish of the furniture and the dry timbers of the roof. Outside, the disciplined ranks of redcoats watched as flames licked up the exterior walls, blackening the white stone. The Treasury building burned nearby. The Capitol building, the very seat of American democracy, was engulfed, its library and legislative chambers turning to ash. To the American observers watching from the distant hills, it looked like the end of their young republic. To Admiral Cockburn, riding a mule through the burning streets with a triumphant air, it was long overdue retribution, a receipt paid in full for the American burning of the Canadian capital of York a year prior. But to understand how a British army came to be eating the president's dinner and burning his home in 1814, one must look back 2 years earlier, to a time when the idea of a British victory in North America seemed not just unlikely, but statistically impossible. The story of this war does not begin with British strength, it begins with British desperation. In June of 1812, the British Empire was not looking toward America. Its eyes were fixed in a terrified stare across the English Channel. Napoleon Bonaparte was the master of Europe. His Grande Armée, hundreds of thousands strong, was marching toward Russia. Britain stood alone, an island fortress bankrupting itself to fund coalition after coalition to stop the French war machine. Every spare musket, every barrel of powder, and every able-bodied soldier was needed in Spain or on the high seas to keep the French at bay. The British army was stretched to its absolute breaking point. It was at this precise moment of maximum vulnerability that the United States Congress declared war. To the British administration in London, this was not a noble second war of independence. It was a stab in the back. It was a calculated, opportunistic land grab by a young neighbour attacking a distracted elder. The American objective was clear and, on paper, easily achievable. The annexation of British North America, the land that would become Canada. The arithmetic of 1812 was brutally simple. The United States had a population of nearly 8 million people. The British colonies in Upper Canada had fewer than 80,000. The American border was lined with populous states and militias ready to march. The Canadian border was defended by a skeleton crew of British regulars, widely scattered and poorly supplied. Thomas Jefferson had famously remarked that the conquest of Canada would be a mere matter of marching. He was not necessarily wrong. The British garrisons were outnumbered 10-1, sometimes 20-1. There were no reinforcements coming from London. Wellington needed every man for the peninsula. The defence of half a continent fell to a handful of regiments, primarily the 41st and the 49th, and the few thousand Canadian militia who might, or might not, show up to fight. By all rights, the map of North America should have been redrawn in the summer of 1812. The Union Jack should have been lowered from Halifax to Detroit, replaced by the Stars and Stripes. That it was not is one of the great anomalies of military history. It is a story that defies the numbers, written not by the overwhelming force of American industry, but by the audacity of a few desperate men who decided that if they could not outnumber the enemy, they would have to outthink, outscare, and outfight them. Before the fires of Washington could burn in 1814, the British first had to survive the impossible summer of 1812. And the key to that survival lay in the hands of a charismatic British general and a visionary Shawnee chief, who were about to teach the Americans that war is not merely a matter of marching. In the summer of 1812, the fate of the British Empire in North America rested on the shoulders of Major General Isaac Brock. Brock was a man cut from a different cloth than the typical aristocratic officers of the era. He was tall, imposing, and possessed a restless energy that chafed against the defensive caution usually prescribed for outnumbered commanders. While the Governor-General of Canada advocated for a passive defense, essentially a slow retreat to Quebec, Brock understood that a defensive war was a losing war. With the Americans gathering on the border in overwhelming numbers, he knew that to sit and wait was to invite defeat. If Canada was to survive, the British had to strike first, and they had to strike hard enough to shatter the American nerve. But Brock had almost no soldiers. His professional corps consisted of the 41st Regiment of Foot, a solid unit, but woefully small for the task at hand. To bolster his ranks, he had to rely on Canadian militia, farmers and tradesmen with little training, and crucially, the indigenous warriors of the First Nations. It was here, on the frontier of the Detroit River, that history witnessed one of its most pivotal meetings. Isaac Brock met Tecumseh, the visionary Shawnee chief who had spent years building a confederacy to stop American expansion. The two men, though from worlds apart, recognized a kindred spirit in one another immediately. Tecumseh saw in Brock a British officer who did not look down on him, but looked him in the eye as an equal partner in war. Brock saw in Tecumseh the Wellington of the Indians, a leader of immense strategic capability and charisma. Their alliance was born of necessity, but forged in mutual respect. Tecumseh provided the one thing Brock's 41st Regiment could not: terror. The American militia, and their aging commander General William Hull, were terrified of the native warriors, fed on decades of frontier rumors and fears of scalping and torture. Brock intended to weaponize that fear. Across the river lay Fort Detroit, a stronghold occupied by General Hull and an American army of roughly 2,500 men, nearly double the force Brock could scrape together. A conventional siege was impossible. The British guns were too few, and time was on the American side. Brock decided to gamble everything on a psychological bluff. He began a campaign of calculated deception designed to dismantle General Hull's mind before a single shot was fired. The ruse began with a letter. Brock allowed a dispatch to fall into American hands, which casually mentioned that no more native warriors could be accommodated at the British camp because there were already 5,000 of them present. It was a fabrication, but to the nervous Hull, it confirmed his worst nightmares. Next came the visual trickery. Brock looked at his ragtag Canadian militia, men dressed in farm clothes who looked nothing like soldiers. He ordered them to don the spare red coats of the 41st Regiment. To the American sentries watching through telescopes across the river, The British force suddenly appeared to be comprised entirely of professional regulars, a disciplined red wall that seemed to have doubled in size overnight, but the masterstroke belonged to Tecumseh. On the morning of August 16th, 1812, the Shawnee chief led his warriors through a small clearing in the woods, visible to the American fort. They marched in single file, painted for war, weapons gleaming in the sun. As they passed out of sight behind a hill, they did not stop. Instead, they circled back through a ravine, ran to the back of the line, and marched through the clearing again. They did this repeatedly. For hours, General Hull, watching with a sinking heart, counted hundreds, then thousands of warriors. He believed he was surrounded by a massive native army, waiting to unleash a massacre upon the soldiers and civilians inside the fort. The final turn of the screw came when the British batteries opened fire. As the cannonballs slammed into the wooden palisades of Fort Detroit, Brock sent an ultimatum to Hull. It was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. He wrote that while he could control his British regulars, he could not guarantee the behavior of his native allies once the fighting began. It was a dark, implicit threat of total slaughter. General Hull, an old man whose nerves were already frayed, collapsed under the pressure. Inside the fort, the American officers were baffled as they saw their commander's resolve disintegrate. Without consulting his staff, and without a serious fight, Hull ordered the white flag raised. When the British entered Detroit, they were stunned. They found 2,500 American soldiers stacking their muskets in surrender. They captured 33 cannons and immense stores of gunpowder, supplies the resource-starved British desperately needed. The Battle of Detroit had cost the British almost no casualties. It was a miracle of audacity. In one stroke, Brock and Tecumseh had not only saved Upper Canada from immediate invasion, but had completely reversed the momentum of the war. The legend of the invincible British redcoat and the terrifying native warrior was cemented in the American psyche, buying the Empire valuable time. But the euphoria of Detroit would be short-lived. The war was far from over, and the tragedy of war was about to claim its first great hero. The humiliation at Detroit sent shockwaves through Washington, but it did not end the war. If anything, it hardened American resolve. The conquest of Canada was no longer just a strategic objective, it was a matter of national honor. By October of 1812, the leaves along the Niagara River were turning the color of blood and gold, and a new, larger American invasion force was massing on the New York side of the gorge. Their target was Queenston Heights, a dominant ridge of escarpment that overlooked the rushing waters of the Niagara River. If the Americans could seize the heights, they would command the gateway to Upper Canada. In the pre-dawn darkness of October 13th, the silence of the river valley was shattered by the dip of oars and the crack of musketry. American boats pushed into the swirling, treacherous currents, aiming for the Canadian shore. The British defenders, a thin screen of the 49th Regiment and local militia, opened fire, but the Americans, driven by numbers and desperation, managed to land. Through a mix of luck and daring, a detachment of American troops found a fisherman's path, a narrow, unguarded goat trail leading up the steep cliff face. While the British were focused on the landing beach, these Americans scaled the heights and seized the British artillery battery overlooking the river. The Union Jack was struck down, the Stars and Stripes was raised. The British had lost the high ground. General Isaac Brock was miles away at Fort George when the sound of distant cannons rolled across the morning air. He did not wait for his army to assemble. True to his nature, he mounted his horse, Alfred, and galloped hard toward the sound of the guns, his personal staff struggling to keep pace. He arrived at Queenston completely mud-splattered, his uniform bright scarlet against the grey autumn sky. What he saw was a disaster in the making. The Americans held the heights, digging in. If they were allowed to fortify that position, the Niagara Peninsula would be lost. Brock knew that time was the enemy. He could not wait for the main body of reinforcements. He had to retake that battery immediately. Dismounting his horse, he drew his saber and rallied the scattered men of the 49th and the York Volunteers. With a calm that belied the chaos around him, he led them on foot, charging straight up the steep, rain-slicked slope toward the American guns. It was a gallant, reckless act of 19th-century heroism. It was also a death sentence. Brock was a massive target, tall, commanding, and conspicuous in his general's uniform. As he urged his men forward, an American marksman in the brush stepped out, leveled his musket, and fired from barely 30 yards away. The ball struck Brock in the chest, piercing his heart. The savior of Canada fell without a word, dying almost instantly on the wet grass of the hillside. The British charge faltered and broke. Their leader was dead, the heights were still in enemy hands, and it seemed that the miracle of Detroit was about to be undone by the tragedy of Queenston. But the battle was not over. As news of Brock's death spread, it did not induce panic. It induced a cold, vengeful fury. More crucially, the sounds of the battle had drawn the attention of the British Empire's most terrifying allies. From the woodlands surrounding the heights emerged the warriors of the Grand River Mohawk, led by chiefs John Norton and John Brant. They did not charge in a line. They moved like ghosts through the trees, their movements masked by the smoke. Suddenly, the Indian yell pierced the air, a high-pitched, undulating war cry that curdled the blood of the American militia on the heights. The psychological impact was immediate. The American soldiers, many of whom were raw recruits, stopped digging. Their eyes darted toward the tree line. They knew the stories of the frontier. They knew what happened to men caught by the warriors. Panic began to set in. The Mohawk skirmishers kept the Americans pinned down, picking them off one by one, buying time for the British reinforcements to arrive. By the afternoon, Major General Roger Sheaffe, Brock's second-in-command, arrived with the main British column. Unlike the impulsive Brock, Sheaffe was methodical. He did not charge up the slope. He marched his men around the flank, climbing the heights from a safer approach to join the Mohawks. The combined force, Redcoats, Canadian militia, and native warriors, formed a tightening noose around the American position. With bayonets fixed, the British line advanced. The Americans, trapped between the oncoming wall of red wool and steel and the sheer drop of the Niagara cliffs behind them, broke completely. The retreat turned into a rout. Men threw down their muskets and scrambled down the cliffs. Many fell to their deaths on the jagged rocks below. Others drowned trying to swim the violent river. The American army at Queenston Heights was annihilated. Nearly 1,000 Americans surrendered. The invasion had been stopped cold. The British had won another impossible victory, securing the border for another winter. But the cost was catastrophic. As the sun set over the Niagara, the Union Jack flew once again over the heights, but it flew at half-mast. Isaac Brock, the charismatic soul of the defence, was gone. The British had held the line, but the war was changing. The Americans were learning. And across the ocean, the British Empire was preparing to unleash a darker, more punitive phase of the war. For 2 long, grinding years, the war settled into a bloody stalemate. The seasons turned, bringing mud, snow, and mosquitoes in equal measure. While there were American successes, particularly on the Great Lakes and at the Battle of the Thames, where the great Tecumseh was finally killed, the conquest of Canada remained a mirage. The British, outnumbered and exhausted, had performed a miracle of endurance. But in the spring of 1814, the geopolitical tectonic plates shifted violently. Across the Atlantic, the news arrived that would freeze the blood of every statesman in Washington, D.C. Paris had fallen. Napoleon Bonaparte, the emperor of the French and the architect of Europe's misery, had abdicated and was exiled to Elba. The Great War in Europe was over. For the first time in decades, the British Empire was not fighting for its life. The Royal Navy, the largest maritime force the world had ever seen, was no longer tethered to the blockade of French ports. The British Army, forged in the fires of the peninsula under the Duke of Wellington, was no longer pinned down in Spain. The great distraction that the United States had counted on was gone. Britain turned its full, undivided gaze toward the irritating sideshow in North America. The mood in London was no longer one of defensive caution. It was one of punitive anger. The American stab in the back was to be repaid. Orders were cut. Thousands of battle-hardened veterans, men of the 4th, 44th and 85th Regiments, marched to the ports of Bordeaux and Plymouth. These were not the raw garrison troops of 1812. These were the men who had stormed the breaches of Badajoz and Salamanca. They were professional killers of the French Empire, disciplined, ruthless, and supremely confident. They boarded transports, not to defend Canada, but to take the war to the American doorstep. Leading this expedition were two men who would become the faces of American nightmares. The army was commanded by Major General Robert Ross, an Irishman and a gentleman officer who was beloved by his men for his bravery and lack of pretension. He was a reluctant arsonist, a soldier who preferred a fair fight in an open field to the ugly business of raiding. His counterpart in the Royal Navy, however, had no such qualms. Rear Admiral George Cockburn was a man who seemed to relish the psychological destruction of his enemy. He knew the Chesapeake Bay intimately, having spent months terrorizing the coastline, burning shipyards, and liberating enslaved people to serve as guides for the British fleet. Cockburn was the hawk to Ross's measured professional. He urged a strike at the heart, Washington. In August 1814, the British Armada appeared in the Chesapeake Bay. It was a terrifying sight. Forests of masts crowding the horizon, the gun ports of the 74-gun ships of the line open and menacing. The target was not immediately clear to the Americans. Would they strike Baltimore, Annapolis, Washington? The Americans, lacking a professional intelligence network, were paralyzed by indecision. They marched their militia back and forth in the sweltering summer heat, exhausting them before the enemy had even landed. On August 19th, General Ross made his move. The fleet sailed up the Patuxent River, the muddy waters parting for the deep drafts of the British transports. They dropped anchor at Benedict, Maryland, a small, sleepy tobacco port. The landing boats were lowered. There was no resistance. The British army waded ashore, their redcoats vivid against the green tobacco fields and the grey river mud. But it was not just infantry that landed. The sailors dragged ashore 3 6-pounder field guns, sweating and cursing as they hauled the iron beasts through the sandy soil. Following them were the Royal Marine Artillery, carrying a weapon that few Americans had ever seen and none were prepared for: the Congreve rocket. These were primitive, terrifying devices, long metal tubes packed with gunpowder and warheads, mounted on sticks. They were notoriously inaccurate, screaming erratically through the air like banshees. But their purpose was not precision. It was panic. The march to Washington began. It was a brutal slog. The Maryland summer was at its peak, with temperatures soaring near 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The high humidity hung like a wet blanket over the column. The British soldiers, still wearing the thick wool uniforms designed for European winters, suffered terribly. Men dropped from heatstroke by the dozens, foaming at the mouth, their bodies convulsing in the dust. Yet, under the iron discipline of their sergeants and the calm leadership of General Ross, they marched on. They moved with a relentless, rhythmic pace that signaled a terrifying inevitability. They were 40 miles from the American capital, and there was seemingly nothing in their path but cornfields and panicked civilians. As they advanced, Admiral Cockburn rode alongside General Ross, constantly whispering in his ear, urging him forward, dismissing the American militia as a rabble that would scatter at the first whiff of gunpowder. He was right. The road to Washington was open, but at a place called Bladensburg, where the road crossed the east branch of the Potomac, the Americans finally turned to make their stand. On August 24, 1814, the small village of Bladensburg became the unlikely setting for one of the most lopsided confrontations in military history. The geography dictated the battle. The main road to Washington crossed a narrow wooden bridge over the eastern branch of the Potomac here. If the Americans wanted to save their capital, they had to hold this bridge. On the heights overlooking the river, the American army had assembled. On paper, it was a formidable force, nearly 7,000 men, outnumbering the exhausted British column of 4,500. They had dug in entrenchments and positioned artillery to sweep the bridge. President James Madison himself rode out to the battlefield, the first and only sitting US president to take the field under fire, creating a sense of momentous occasion. But beneath the surface, the American army was a hollow shell. It was a patchwork force of local militia, farmers, clerks, and shopkeepers who had been dragged from their homes with barely a day's rations and even less training. They were commanded by Brigadier General William Winder, a lawyer with little military aptitude, who had spent the previous days marching his men into a state of exhaustion trying to guess the British route. Around noon, the heat was already stifling. The dust cloud on the horizon signalled the arrival of the British. As the vanguard of the British Light Brigade emerged from the woods, they did not stop to rest or reconnoitre. They saw the bridge, they saw the Americans on the hill, and they simply kept coming. The American artillery opened fire. Cannonballs smashed into the British ranks, tearing holes in the columns. But the Redcoats did not waver. The gaps were instantly filled, the step was regained, and the march continued. It was a display of professional discipline that the American militia had never seen. The British 85th Light Infantry, led by Colonel William Thornton, sprinted for the bridge. They took casualties, men falling into the shallow water, but they surged across, bayonets fixing with a metallic rasp that carried across the valley. Once across, the British did not form a traditional static line. Instead, they deployed in extended order, skirmish lines that utilized the terrain, moving quickly and firing with deadly precision. And then came the rockets. The Royal Marine Artillery set up their troughs and unleashed the Congreves. The rockets screeched into the sky with a terrifying, unearthly roar, leaving trails of smoke and sparks. They corkscrewed through the air, exploding over the heads of the American militia. Physically, they did little damage compared to cannon fire. Psychologically, they were devastating. To the raw recruits on the hill, it seemed as if the sky itself was attacking them. As the rockets shrieked overhead, the British infantry began their advance up the slope. They moved through the tall grass, the sun glinting off their bayonets. When they got within range, they delivered a single crashing volley of musket fire and then charged. The sight of thousands of combat veterans rushing forward through the smoke, screaming and eager to close the distance, was too much. The American left flank disintegrated first. Militia units broke and ran before the British even reached them. The panic was contagious. It rippled down the line like a collapsing dam. Officers shouted orders that were ignored. Men threw down their weapons and fled into the woods. The retreat was so rapid, so chaotic, and so total that the British soldiers, exhausted from the heat and the march, collapsed laughing. They could not catch the fleeing Americans. One British officer wryly noted that the Americans were too fast to be captured, leading to the battle's mocking nickname, the Bladensburg Races. Only one American unit held its ground, Commodore Joshua Barney's flotilla men. These were sailors and Marines, tough professionals who had dragged their heavy naval guns to the battlefield. They fought with savage determination, blasting the British advance with grapeshot and using their cutlasses to repel bayonet charges. They inflicted the heaviest casualties of the day on the British, fighting until they were surrounded and their ammunition was gone. Barney himself, wounded and bleeding, was captured. General Ross and Admiral Cockburn, impressed by his bravery amidst the cowardice of the rest, immediately paroled him and ensured his medical care, a moment of chivalry in the midst of slaughter. By 4:00 p.m. the guns fell silent. The road to Washington was wide open. There was no army left to defend the capital. The government had fled. President Madison was a refugee in his own country. General Ross allowed his men a few hours of rest in the shade of the conquered battlefield. They reformed their columns, the adrenaline of victory temporarily masking their fatigue. As the sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows across the Maryland countryside, the order was given to march. The destination was visible in the distance, undefended and waiting. Twilight descended upon the swampy banks of the Potomac as the British Army marched into the federal city. The silence was absolute and unnerving. Washington, D.C. in 1814 was not a sprawling metropolis. It was a half-finished ambition, a collection of grand stone edifices rising awkwardly out of muddy fields and scattered woodlands. Most of the civilian population, terrorized by the rumors of British brutality, had fled into the surrounding countryside, clogging the roads with wagons and livestock. The windows of the houses were shuttered. The streets were empty. The only sound was the rhythmic tramp of thousands of hobnailed boots echoing off the vacant buildings. General Robert Ross and Admiral George Cockburn rode at the head of the column. As they entered the city proper, a scattering of musket fire erupted from a house near the capital. The general's horse was shot out from under him, a violation of the rules of war that snapped the British patience. The house was immediately stormed and put to the torch, the first spark in a night of inferno. The column halted before the unfinished Capitol building, the grand symbol of the American Republic. It stood as a massive stone testament to the new nation's pride. To the British soldiers, however, it represented the government that had declared war on them while they were fighting for survival against Napoleon. There was no hesitation. The troops burst through the heavy doors. Inside, they found the two wings, the House and the Senate, connected by a wooden walkway. They piled the furniture of democracy into heaps in the center of the chambers. Desks, chairs, and books from the Library of Congress were tossed onto the pyres. They used gunpowder paste to ensure the flames would catch. Within minutes, fire roared out of the windows, illuminating the night sky with a hellish orange glow that could be seen for miles in every direction. Leaving the Capitol consumed by flames, the British commanders turned their attention down Pennsylvania Avenue toward the President's house. The march was a surreal victory parade through a ghost town, illuminated by the burning skyline behind them. When they arrived at the executive mansion, they found the doors unlocked. The scene inside was one of interrupted domesticity that bordered on the absurd. As described earlier, the table was set for a victory celebration that never happened. The wine was cooling. The meats were still on the spit in the kitchen. For the starving British officers, who had been marching and fighting in the oppressive heat for days, it was an irresistible prize. They ate the president's food and drank his wine, a final insult to the injury they were about to inflict. But the dinner was merely a pause in the destruction. Admiral Cockburn, reveling in the humiliation of the enemy, oversaw the systematic burning of the mansion. Personal items were largely spared. Ross was adamant that this was a war against the government, not against Mrs. Madison, but the symbols of state were fair game. Torches were touched to the velvet curtains. The dry wood of the interior caught instantly. The soldiers stood in the garden, watching as tongues of fire curled out of the upper windows, blackening the white sandstone facade that gave the house its name. The destruction continued throughout the night. The Treasury building was burned. The War Department was gutted. The arsenal was destroyed. The entire administrative heart of the United States government was being surgically removed by fire. Yet, amidst the chaos, the British discipline held. Private property was strictly respected. When soldiers passed by private residences, they assured the terrified occupants that they had nothing to fear so long as they remained inside. Looters, even among their own ranks, were threatened with immediate execution. This was not a riot. It was a military operation. By the early hours of August 25th, the British Army withdrew to the outskirts of the city to camp on Capitol Hill, the high ground illuminated by the smouldering ruins of the city below. The smoke hung thick and heavy in the humid air, stinging the eyes and throats of the conquerors. To the Americans watching from the Virginia hills, the psychological blow was total. Their army had fled, their government was in hiding, and their capital was a smoking ruin. The British had proved their point. The United States was vulnerable, and the cost of this war would be paid in ashes. However, as the sun rose on a devastated Washington, the atmosphere began to change. The heat, which had been oppressive for days, grew heavy and still. The sky turned a bruised, greenish black. The birds stopped singing. The British soldiers, resting among the ruins, looked up with unease. They had defeated the American army, but they were about to face a force of nature that no amount of discipline could repel. The storm that saved Washington was gathering on the horizon. The morning of August 25th, 1814, dawned with an ominous stillness over the smouldering ruins of Washington. The fires from the previous night had largely burned themselves down to glowing embers, leaving the stone skeletons of the Capitol and the President's house standing stark and black against the sky. The British troops, camped on Capitol Hill, were exhausted. They were conquerors, yes, but they were also strangers in a strange land, thousands of miles from home, surrounded by a hostile population and a sullen, sweltering climate. General Ross and Admiral Cockburn were preparing to continue their work. There were still government buildings to be destroyed, specifically the War Office and the offices of the National Intelligencer, a newspaper that had printed particularly vicious attacks against Cockburn. But as the officers issued their morning orders, the sky began to darken with a speed that startled even the seasoned sailors among them. It was not merely a summer storm, it was a meteorological collision of violent proportions. The heat wave that had baked the region for weeks was colliding with a massive cold front, creating a supercell of terrifying power. The wind began to pick up, whipping the dust and ash of the ruined city into blinding grey clouds. The temperature dropped plummetingly fast. Then, the heavens opened. Rain did not fall. It was driven horizontally like grape shot. Thunder exploded directly overhead, shaking the ground with the force of artillery. Bolts of lightning struck the city repeatedly, shattering trees and toppling chimneys. The British soldiers, exposed on the heights of Capitol Hill, scrambled for cover, but there was none. They huddled under wagons or pressed themselves against the few remaining walls, but the wind was tearing roofs off of houses and sending debris flying through the air like shrapnel. And then the unthinkable happened. A tornado formed. It touched down in the center of the city, tearing a path of destruction through the very streets the British had just conquered. It lifted 2 cannons, heavy iron guns weighing thousands of pounds, and tossed them through the air like toys, killing several British soldiers and mangling others. Buildings that had survived the arson were flattened by the wind. The roof of the patent office was ripped off. For the British, it was a terrifying, bewildering experience. They had fought the French, the Spanish, and the Americans, but they had never fought a hurricane. The violence of the storm seemed almost supernatural, as if the land itself was rejecting the invaders. The torrential rain, however, had one unintended consequence. In less than 2 hours, it completely extinguished the fires that had been consuming the capital. The storm that killed British soldiers also saved the remaining structures of Washington from total annihilation. By late afternoon, the storm passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a battered, soaked, and chaotic landscape. The British Army was in disarray. Their uniforms were sodden, their ammunition was wet, and the roads had turned into impassable quagmires of mud and fallen timber. General Ross, looking at his battered force, realized that the window for occupation had closed. They had made their point. They had humiliated the American government and destroyed its military capability in the region. To stay longer was to invite disease, counterattack, and logistical collapse. That night, under the cover of darkness, the British Army began its retreat. They left their campfires burning to deceive any American scouts and marched silently back toward the waiting fleet at Benedict. The march back was a ghostly mirror of the advance. The men were weary, many limping from wounds or the sheer physical toll of the campaign. They passed the battlefield of Bladensburg, now silent and grisly, where the unburied dead lay swollen in the heat. When they finally reached the ships days later, the sailors welcomed them with cheers, but the men were too exhausted to celebrate. They collapsed onto the decks, sleeping where they fell. They had accomplished what no other army had done before or since. They had captured and burned the capital of the United States. But as the fleet weighed anchor and turned its bow toward Baltimore, the mood was not one of final victory. The rocket's red glare was about to illuminate a different kind of battle, one where the Americans would not run, and where the British luck would finally run out. The burning of Washington was the high water mark of the British punitive campaign. It was a tactical masterstroke and a strategic shock, but it had an unintended side effect. It did not break the American will to fight. It forged it. The sight of their capital in flames replaced political division with a cold, hard patriotism. The Bladensburg races were over. The defense of Baltimore was about to begin. As the British fleet sailed away from the charred remains of Washington, the smoke of the burning capital signaled a dark realization for the American leadership. The war, which had begun 2 years earlier with boastful predictions of a mere matter of marching, had devolved into a fight for national survival. The United States was bankrupt, Its currency had collapsed. Its coastlines were strangled by a Royal Navy blockade so tight that American trade had effectively ceased to exist. And most damning of all, the primary objective of the war, the annexation of Canada, remained a complete and total failure. While the dramatic raid on Washington captured the headlines and the history books, the true victory of the British Army lay not in the destruction of the White House, but in the silence of the northern frontier. For 3 bloody years, American armies had thrown themselves against the border of British North America. They had crossed the Detroit River, the Niagara River, and the St. Lawrence. They had outnumbered the British defenders in almost every engagement, and yet, by the autumn of 1814, not a single square inch of Canadian territory remained firmly in American hands. This was the quiet triumph of the Redcoat. In the dense forests of the Niagara Peninsula and the frozen woodlands of Quebec, the British regulars, supported by the Canadian militia and their First Nations allies, had constructed an impenetrable wall. The names of the battles, Stony Creek, Chrysler's Farm, Châteauguay, were less famous than Bladensburg, but they were far more strategically significant. At Chrysler's Farm, a British force outnumbered 4-1 had routed an American invasion column using superior drill and discipline, firing volleys with the precision of a machine. At Châteauguay, a force of French-Canadian voltigeurs and warriors had used horns and illusion in the woods to turn back a massive American army marching on Montreal. The British defence of Canada was a masterclass in economy of force. With the bulk of the Empire's resources tied up fighting Napoleon in Europe, the garrisons in North America had been left to starve. They fought in threadbare uniforms, often patching their red coats with local grey wool. They marched through winters that froze the mercury in the glass. Yet, they held. They held because they were professionals fighting amateurs. They held because men like Isaac Brock had instilled an aggressive spirit that refused to accept the mathematics of defeat. And they held because for the Canadian militia fighting alongside them, this was not a war of conquest. It was a war for their homes. By late 1814, the American government faced a grim calculus. The British Empire, now fully freed from the Napoleonic Wars, was beginning to shift its colossal weight toward America. The raid on Washington was just the tip of the spear. Reports were arriving of a massive new British expeditionary force gathering in the Caribbean, aiming for the strategic port of New Orleans. Another army was massing in Canada for a push south. The United States was running out of money, men, and time. Across the Atlantic, in the neutral city of Ghent, British and American diplomats met to discuss peace. The atmosphere was frosty. The British delegates, buoyed by the news of Washington's destruction and the successful defense of Canada, initially held a hard line. They proposed an Indian buffer state in the Midwest, a dream that Tecumseh had died for, and demanded territorial concessions in Maine and Minnesota. However, the British people were also tired. After 20 years of continuous global warfare against the French Revolution and Napoleon, the British treasury was exhausted, and the public clamoured for peace. The Duke of Wellington himself, when asked to take command in America, advised the government that while he could go, he could not guarantee a decisive victory without naval superiority on the Great Lakes, something the British had lost. He argued that since the Americans had failed to take Canada and the British held the American coast, a peace based on the status quo ante bellum, the state of things before the war, was the most logical outcome. And so, the strange logic of the War of 1812 solidified. The Americans, who had declared war to take Canada and end British maritime restrictions, had achieved neither. Canada was still British. The maritime restrictions had ended simply because the war with France was over. The British, who had fought simply to defend their colonies, had succeeded completely. They had repelled the invasion. They had burned the enemy capital. They had secured the border. On Christmas Eve, 1814, the Treaty of Ghent was signed. It was a peace treaty that changed no borders and addressed almost none of the original grievances. But in the context of the British Empire, it was a victory of preservation. Against overwhelming odds, the Redcoats had kept the Union Jack flying over the north. The mere matter of marching had turned into a 3-year lesson in the resilience of the British soldier. But as the ink dried on the parchment in Europe, a tragedy of timing was unfolding in the Gulf of Mexico. News traveled at the speed of sail, and the fastest ships took weeks to cross the Atlantic. The peace had been signed, but the war was not quite done with its killing. Below the mists of the Mississippi River, the largest British invasion force of the entire war was rowing through the swamps toward New Orleans, unaware that they were marching into a battle for a war that was already over. The final act of the War of 1812 was played out in the fog-choked swamps of Louisiana, a tragic postscript written in blood. On January 8, 1815, 2 weeks after the peace treaty had been signed in Ghent, a massive British force under General Edward Pakenham launched a frontal assault against Andrew Jackson's entrenched lines at New Orleans. It was a disaster. Pakenham was killed, and over 2,000 British soldiers fell in barely 30 minutes of fighting. To the Americans, this victory was cathartic. It allowed them to end a disastrous war on a high note, creating a myth of triumph that would persist for centuries. The Battle of New Orleans became the lens through which the United States viewed the entire conflict, conveniently obscuring the failures of the previous 3 years. But when the smoke cleared and the treaties were ratified, the map told the true story. The United States had fought to end British maritime rights. Those rights remained untouched. They had fought to annex Canada. Canada remained firmly British. They had fought to drive the Redcoats from the continent. Instead, the Redcoats had driven the American government from its own capital. For the British soldiers who survived the campaigns of 1814, there was no ticker-tape parade in London. The War of 1812 had always been a secondary theatre, a distraction from the existential struggle against Napoleon. As the transports carried the veterans of Washington and Bladensburg back across the Atlantic, they did not return to peace. They returned to a Europe that was igniting once again. Napoleon had escaped from Elba. The 100 Days had begun. Many of the same men of the 4th and 44th Regiments, who had walked through the burning halls of the White House, would find themselves just months later standing in the mud of Waterloo, forming squares against the French cavalry. For them, America was just another campaign, another hard march in a lifetime of war. Yet their legacy in North America is indelible. The defense of Canada remains one of the most improbable military feats of the 19th century. A handful of British regulars, allied with determined Canadian militia and the warriors of Tecumseh's Confederacy, had held the line against a nation with 10 times their population. They had proven that discipline, leadership, and psychological warfare could overcome overwhelming numerical superiority. Today, the War of 1812 is often remembered in the United States as a second war of independence, a draw that felt like a win. But from the perspective of the British Empire, it was a clear and decisive strategic victory. The objective was the defense of His Majesty's North American colonies, and that objective was achieved in full. The border remained. The Union Jack continued to fly over Halifax, Quebec, and Toronto, and the dream of a continental United States, stretching unbroken from the Gulf of Mexico to the Arctic Circle, died on the bayonets of the British infantry. The Redcoats who fought in North America, the men who bluffed Detroit into surrender, who charged the heights of Queenston, and who ate the president's dinner in Washington, faded into history, overshadowed by the giants of Wellington and Waterloo. But their story is not one of a forgotten war. It is the story of the campaigns Britain actually won. It is the story of how the empire, even when distracted, exhausted, and outnumbered, refused to yield. Thank you for listening to our story. If you found this history as fascinating as we did, please like this video and subscribe to British War History for more. We read all of your comments, so be sure to leave your thoughts below. We'll see you in the next video.